The sound wasn't loud enough to be a threat. That's what Hudson Carrick would tell himself later, when he tried to explain why a man with 3 loaded guns within arm's reach had opened his front door at 2:47 in the morning, instead of putting a round through it first. He was 37 years old, the head of a $400 million empire that stretched from Denver to Chicago to Las Vegas. And there were exactly 2 people on Earth who knew he was at this cabin in the mountains outside Aspen himself, and the man who'd pulled a bullet out of his shoulder 4 days before. So when he heard something breathing on the other side of the door, slow and heavy and patient, he didn't reach for the gun. He reached for the handle. And what he saw on that porch, in the rain, at 2:45 in the morning, would unmake every rule he'd spent 18 years building his life on. A full-grown Neapolitan Mastiff, soaked black, stood on the top step with a plastic carrier clenched between her teeth. Inside the carrier was a puppy, no older than 3 weeks, and tied to the Mastiff's collar, folded twice against the rain, was a note card with 4 words written in a woman's hand. SOS. 3 nights only. Hudson Carrick didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't believe in mercy. He didn't believe in kindness that didn't come with a price tag. But he stood in that doorway in a shirt still stained with his own blood, and he looked at a dog that had been trained expertly, patiently, over months to find him at an address that shouldn't have existed on any record. And he understood one thing before he understood anything else. Somebody had been watching him. Somebody who knew him well enough to trust him with something small and breathing. And somebody, somewhere, was running out of time. If you're still with me, hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a slow burn, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This one's going to stay with you. Now let's go back to that porch, that rain, and the dog who was about to rewrite a killer's life. Hudson didn't close the door right away. He stood there for another 3 seconds, his left hand still resting on the handle, his right hand already having pulled the Glock 19 from the drawer beside the doorframe. The round had been chambered 4 nights earlier, and hadn't left the weapon since. He didn't look at the dog. He looked through it, into the black sheet of rain behind it, into the forest sloping down toward the abandoned trail that only locals knew. No headlights, no distant engine noise, no human shape pressed behind a tree trunk, only rain, and a thin ribbon of steam rising from the Mastiff's wet coat, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the cold metallic scent of the gun in his hand. Hudson stepped out onto the porch. 1 step, 2. His thin leather slippers were soaked at once. He didn't notice. He was reading the ground. The thin layer of snow covering the porch steps and stretching down the stone path held only a single trail. Dog prints, 4 toes, wide pads, heavy with the weight of an animal close to 90 kilos, plus the crate it was carrying. The prints came in a straight line from the eastern edge of the woods, across the frozen lawn, and stopped exactly in front of the house. No shoe prints, no tire marks, not a single human footprint at all. The dog had come here alone, and it knew the way. Hudson raised the Glock and aimed it straight at the Mastiff. The dog didn't blink. It set the crate down gently, as if it were setting down a child, then sat, its front legs folded neatly together, its head slightly bowed. Its tail struck the ground once. That wasn't how a frightened dog behaved. It wasn't how an attacking dog waiting for a command behaved either. This was the posture of an animal trained to wait. Hudson had seen many kinds of weapons in 18 years, and he knew what a well-controlled weapon looked like. This dog was a weapon, but it hadn't been ordered to fire. He lowered the gun 5 centimeters. Not quite trust, just a shift in focus, away from killing and toward understanding. The rain blurred his sight, and the wound in his right shoulder began to throb with the rhythm of his heartbeat. 4 days wasn't enough to heal. But he didn't have another 4 days. He had exactly 40 seconds before his legs went numb and mistakes began. He reached down with his left hand and took hold of the plastic crate's handle. It was lighter than he'd expected. The puppy inside couldn't weigh more than 3 kilos. It was trembling, but it wasn't crying. It was breathing. Hudson stepped backward into the house, the crate in his left hand, the gun still in his right. The Mastiff rose and followed without needing a command. It crossed the threshold like a guest that had been here 10 times before, and that, more than anything else that had happened that night, sent a cold shiver through Hudson's spine. He shut the door, locked the top bolt, locked the bottom one. 2 turns. Dropped the solid steel bar into place, the one a craftsman in Montana had made specifically for this house. Then he walked along the row of living room windows, drawing each heavy curtain closed with deliberate calm, so that no one watching from outside could read the rhythm of his breathing from the way he moved. Only when the room was sealed tight as a vault did he turn back to look at the two dogs standing in the middle of his wool rug. Water dripped from the mastiff's coat onto the rug, forming a small tear-shaped puddle. The puppy inside the crate had stopped trembling and was asleep. Hudson stood there, the Glock still in his hand, his shirt still marked with his own dried blood, and he realized something so grimly funny it almost made him laugh. If he hadn't gone 4 days without laughing, he had 3 guns within reach, a security system worth $200,000, a $400 million corporation, and a list of men who owed him their lives long enough to require 2 separate files. But he didn't have a bowl. He didn't have a clean towel. He didn't have a single bag of dog food. He didn't have one thing in that house designed to keep a small living creature alive. He had spent 18 years building a fortress that could withstand an assault. It couldn't withstand this. He set the Glock down on the granite kitchen counter, opened the refrigerator. Inside were 3 bottles of water, a jar of Dijon mustard, and 2 slices of cold cuts he couldn't remember buying. He took 1 bottle of water, tore off the label, poured half of it into the Baccarat crystal bowl that Beckett's predecessor had given him for Christmas in the year 2007. The bowl was worth $3,000. He set it on the floor in front of the mastiff. The dog didn't drink right away. It looked at him, looked at the bowl, looked back at him. Then it lowered its head and drank, slowly, with perfect manners, like an animal that had been taught never to lunge at food from a stranger. Hudson stood watching the mastiff drink for about a minute. He didn't know why he stood there that long. Then he crouched down, one knee touching the floor, and placed his left hand on top of the dog's head. Its fur was wet and cold and thicker than he'd expected. The skin beneath was warm, alive, with a faint pulse at the back of its neck where the vein ran down toward the shoulder. The dog didn't move. It kept drinking, slowly, as if having a stranger place a hand on its head was something it had been trained to accept. And that was when the memory came, without warning, without permission, in the way the things that should have stayed buried the deepest always choose to return. He was 8 years old. He was sitting on the cold concrete floor of the shed behind the house in Scottsdale, Arizona, and a Labrador named Scout was lying on its side in front of him, its breathing already reduced to shallow, thinning rasps. That dog was 3 years old. Yellow coat, amber brown eyes. It had been his birthday gift when he turned 5, the only gift his father had ever given him without conditions attached, or at least without conditions an 8-year-old child could see. Someone had gone into the shed the night before. Someone had used an iron bar. His father didn't allow Scout to be taken to a veterinarian, because a veterinarian meant paperwork, and paperwork meant questions, and questions were the one thing the Carrick family never answered. His father had only stood in the shed doorway, tall, wearing a gray sweater, and watched his son hold the dying dog. He didn't step inside. He said exactly one sentence, and that sentence had stayed inside him for 29 years, hardening into something firmer than belief and colder than principle. He said, "This is the price of loving something. Remember it." Then he turned and went back into the house. Scout died in his arms 37 minutes later. The dog's blood soaked through his t-shirt, down into his jeans, dried on his palms in reddish-brown patches that he didn't wash off for 2 days, because he wanted to remember. He wanted to remember exactly what price his father had meant. That was the first time blood got on Hudson Carrick's hands. The second time, 4 years later, it wasn't a dog's blood. And ever since then, he had done exactly one thing. He never let anyone or anything stay close to him long enough to die painfully. He didn't keep dogs. He had no friends except the ones who were paid. He didn't date anyone for more than 3 nights, and not once in 18 years of running an empire had he allowed a living creature to sleep under his roof without a tactical reason. His hand was still resting on the mastiff's head. He realized his hand was trembling, very slightly, at the joint of his ring finger. He pulled it back as if he had just touched a hot stove. The dog lifted its head and looked at him. And for the first time since opening the door, Hudson realized something he should have noticed from the very beginning. This mastiff also had amber brown eyes. He stood up too quickly, and his right shoulder protested with a stab of pain that shot through his neck. He walked to the kitchen counter, picked up his encrypted satellite phone, and pressed the only speed dial number assigned on the device. The phone rang once. Beckett Lane answered on the second ring. His voice was fully awake, which no normal person could have managed at 3:14 in the morning. But Hudson had never counted Beckett among normal people. 18 years at each other's side. Former Navy special operator, 52 years old. Wife dead in a car crash he never spoke of again afterward. And the only man on earth permitted to know which road led to this house. "Something's happened," Hudson said. 3 seconds of silence. "Casualty?" Beckett asked. "Dogs," Hudson answered. Another 2 seconds of silence. Hudson heard the sound of Beckett pulling open a desk drawer, the click of a gun case unlocking, the jingle of car keys. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Beckett said. Hudson ended the call. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter, looked across the room, toward the mastiff now standing once more beside the plastic crate, guarding the sleeping puppy inside. He thought about the blood-soaked t-shirt from when he was 8. He thought about what his father had said. And for the first time in many years, Hudson Carrick wondered whether his father had been wrong. Beckett arrived at 3:31 in the morning, exactly 13 minutes earlier than promised, which was what Hudson had expected, because in 18 years Beckett had never once arrived later than the mark he set for himself. Hudson heard tires grind over gravel, a V8 engine skillfully muffled, then 3 short knocks on the front door in a rhythm only 2 men in the world knew. Hudson opened the door. Beckett stepped inside, carrying with him the scent of clean gunpowder and black coffee gone cold. Wearing a thick gray wool coat buttoned all the way to the neck, his left hand holding a silver military duffel bag, worn soft at all 4 corners. Beneath his right arm was the grip of a Kimber 1911, whose factory bluing had worn away, exposing the black steel underneath. He walked straight through the living room without removing his coat, glanced at the mastiff sitting beside the plastic crate, then turned back to look at Hudson. His first sentence wasn't a greeting. "Were you planning to kill the big one yet?" Beckett asked. Hudson shook his head. "Still considering it," he said. Beckett set the bag on the floor, pulled the zipper open, and took out a pair of black nitrile gloves, a pair of tactical glasses, a handheld signal detector the length of a palm, a specialized flashlight fitted with a violet filter, and an infrared thermometer. He put on the gloves before he put on the glasses. It was a sequence he had repeated on 100 different nights, in 100 different houses, and Hudson had never once seen him do it out of order. Beckett knelt in front of the mastiff. He didn't extend a hand for it to sniff. That was what beginners did. He only looked into its eyes for 3 seconds, then gave a very slight nod, and the dog allowed him to touch its neck. The signal detector moved slowly along the dog's body, from ear to tail, then over the dark leather collar. Not a single beep. "No electronic tracker," Beckett said. "No recording device. No GPS chip. No low-frequency transmitter." He removed the collar, placed it on the coffee table beneath the light, and lifted his nose to within 3 centimeters of the leather to smell it. He inhaled 3 times at 3 different points along the length of the collar. When he looked up, his eyes had changed. "This smells like you," Beckett said. Hudson raised an eyebrow. "More specifically," Beckett continued, "this is the scent of the bath soap you use, the cologne you stopped wearing in April last year, and the smell of walnut wood from the woodworking shop at your Cherry Hills Village estate. 3 sources, 3 layers, soaked deep into the leather. Someone has been training this dog to know your scent for months. Not a week, not a month. Months." Hudson said nothing. He felt the temperature in the room drop by 2 degrees, not because the actual temperature had changed, but because his body was drawing blood back toward the vital organs, preparing for a war whose enemy he still couldn't see. Beckett turned to the plastic crate. He lifted it, rotated it beneath the light. 4 ventilation holes drilled in perfect symmetry. At the bottom of the crate was a pale gray liner about 1 centimeter thick, fitted with a thin lithium battery strip and a small thermostat the size of a coin. Beckett touched the liner with the back of his hand. "Temperature held steady at 38 degrees Celsius, he said, "exactly the body temperature of a mother dog. This is the kind of transport liner emergency veterinary clinics use for orphaned kittens and puppies, not something from a supermarket. This kind has to be ordered through a professional supplier, $300 each, delivered within 48 hours. He opened the crate door, lifted the puppy out with both hands, and placed it on the towel he had just taken from the bag. The puppy let out 1 soft sound, then fell silent. Beckett felt its belly, checked its gums, turned over all 4 paws to inspect the pads, then pressed the infrared thermometer to the inside of its ear. 3 weeks old, he said. Female. Weighs about 2.8 kilos. In good health. Nursed from its mother within the last 2 hours. He placed the puppy back into the crate, closed the door, then stood and looked straight at Hudson. "This isn't someone panicking and dumping 2 animals," Beckett said. "This is an operation. This person has been planning for at least 4 months, maybe 6. They knew where you'd be tonight. They knew you'd open the door. They knew you wouldn't shoot, and they bet the lives of 2 dogs on all 3 of those things." Hudson looked down at the mastiff lying at his feet, then back up at Beckett. "Who on earth knows me that well?" he asked. Beckett pulled off the gloves, dropped them into the bag, and didn't answer right away. "That's not the question," he finally said. "That's the answer you're afraid of." Beckett pointed toward the collar lying on the coffee table, where the folded piece of paper still rested beneath the leather strap. "Open it," he said, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. Hudson picked up the paper with 2 fingers and held it beneath the table lamp. Beckett stood beside him, the handheld magnifier already drawn from the inner pocket of his coat. The paper was smaller than a palm, all 4 edges sharp but not perfectly even, with a faint, serrated mark along the left side. "Moleskin notebook," Beckett said after 3 seconds. "Medium hardcover size, cream 80-gram paper, torn carefully along the perforation, but the hand shook slightly on the second tier. Someone used to moleskin, but not used to tearing paper while afraid." Hudson touched the corner of the page. It still held a trace of dampness along the lower edge from the rain outside. The 2 letters SOS and the 3 words 3 nights only were written on the front, pressed lightly into the paper by the pressure of the pen. Beckett moved the magnifier slowly across the handwriting. "Blue-black ink," he said. "Not navy blue, not pure black. This is Lamy ink, possibly T52, sold in high-end stationery shops or ordered online. Fine point nib, used regularly, tip worn slightly to the right, which means the writer is right-handed and has been using this pen for at least 2 years. The handwriting belongs to a woman," he went on, "but not the decorative kind. No loops, no flourishes. This is the hand of someone who learned to write clearly under pressure. Could be a nurse, could be a science student, could be someone used to taking notes in conditions where there was no room for error." Hudson looked at the 4 words on the page and thought about the hand that had written them, a hand that hadn't trembled on SOS, but had trembled slightly on the word only, as if the writer had made it to the last word before finally allowing herself to be afraid. "Turn it over," Beckett said. Hudson turned the paper over. There was more writing on the back, smaller, denser, arranged into 6 short lines, as if the writer had come back to the page after walking a few steps, realized she hadn't said enough, and bent over some flat surface to write more before tying it to the collar. "Her name is Piper. 3 weeks old. Her mother is named Scout. She'll obey you. If I don't come back in 72 hours, don't look for me. Don't return them. Keep them. They're the only kind thing I have left." Hudson read it once, then read it a second time, then read it a third time, more slowly, 1 word to each beat, and when he reached the word Scout on the 3rd line, he stopped. He said nothing for 15 seconds. Beckett stood still, the magnifier still in his hand, studying Hudson's face with the professional eye of a man who had learned to read cracks in a wall before they split wide open. "Her name is Scout," Hudson finally asked, his voice so low it was almost only breath. "Yes," Beckett answered. "That's what the paper says." Hudson set the page back down on the coffee table with a care that was absurd for something weighing less than 1 gram. He turned and walked toward the window, even though the curtains were already drawn shut. Stood there with his back to Beckett, and no one in the room said anything for such a long stretch that even the mastiff noticed the change and lifted its head to look. Beckett had followed Hudson for 18 years. He had seen him interrogate men twice his size without ever raising his voice. He had seen him sign a death sentence over breakfast and finish his plate of eggs afterward. He had seen him shot twice and not lose a single beat of breath. But he had never seen Hudson Carrick stand this still, his spine so straight it looked painful, because of 1 handwritten word on a scrap of paper. Beckett didn't ask. He had learned long ago that there were rooms inside Hudson no one was invited into, not even him, and the room called Scout was clearly one of them. Instead, he picked up the paper again, read the back once more, then set it down. "This isn't someone abandoning 2 dogs, Beckett said. Hudson didn't turn back, but his shoulder tilted the slightest fraction toward the voice, the only sign that he was listening. "The person who wrote this weighed every word," Beckett continued. "She didn't say I don't want them. She didn't say take them away. She said if I don't come back. She said don't return them. She called Piper and Scout the only kind thing she had left. and people don't call something they're throwing away by those words. This isn't someone abandoning dogs, Hudson. This is someone running for her life, and she chose to entrust the two most precious things she had to the man she believed was dangerous enough to keep them safe. The only question left is how many bodies she left behind to reach your door tonight. Hudson still didn't turn around. He said only one word, and it was so quiet Beckett had to step closer to hear it. 72 hours, Hudson said. Beckett glanced at his wristwatch. We've already lost 48 minutes, he replied. Over the next 48 hours, the house in Aspen became a compact command center for 2 men and 2 dogs. Beckett unpacked a military laptop from his duffel bag, connected it to the private satellite network the Carrick organization had established in the year 2017, and began working at the walnut dining table. Hudson sat across from him, the satellite phone on his left, a black leather notebook on his right, and the plastic crate beneath his chair. They laid out 3 hypotheses on the first sheet of paper. The first hypothesis was a trap, an operation by a rival that had sent the 2 dogs in order to attach a tracking device, poison, or simply test Hudson's response while he was at his weakest after the wound. Beckett crossed that hypothesis out after 40 minutes of examination. There was nothing electronic on either dog or on the crate. Poison wasn't compatible with a 3-week-old puppy still being alive. No one would stake a probing operation on the lives of 2 living creatures the sender had called the only kind thing she had left. The second hypothesis was an internal leak, that someone inside the organization had let the Aspen House address slip to the outside. Beckett crossed that one out after 15 seconds. The address of this house existed only in the minds of 2 men, and one of them was sitting here. Hudson didn't ask again. He knew Beckett. He had once watched Beckett stay silent for 6 months while being tortured in Afghanistan, back when he served in Naval Special Operations. And if Beckett wanted someone to know something, that person would know, and if he didn't, they wouldn't. The third hypothesis was what remained. An outsider, not an enemy, not an ally, had observed Hudson Carrick for long enough to train a dog to find its way to him in a place even his lawyer didn't know about. Beckett pulled up the camera system along the forest roads onto the screen. There were 37 cameras placed within a 3-mile radius around the house, disguised as broken public phone boxes or old boundary posts, connected back to a server in New Mexico and storing data for 60 days. He scrolled back 4 months, filtered for biological movement with a mass of 70 kilos or more, and started watching. For 3 hours, he found nothing. In the 4th hour, he stopped. Here, he said. Hudson got up and walked around the table. On the screen, in a black and white frame recorded at 7:14 in the evening, a woman in a dark coat was walking along the eastern trail, a leash in her hand leading a large mastiff. The frame was about 1.8 miles from the house. Her face was too far away and too dark to identify, but her build was clear. She was about 1.70 meters tall, thin, her shoulders tilting slightly to the left, as if she were carrying something heavy at that hip. Her stride long and steady, never once stopping to look around. Someone familiar with this terrain. Beckett rewound to another clip, 2 months earlier, at 6:52 in the morning. The same build, the same dog. This time she stopped exactly once, at the point where the trail branched toward the house, and stood still for 14 seconds looking in that direction. Then she turned and kept walking. Twice in 4 months, Beckett said, each time at a different hour, avoiding Ranger Peak hours, each time with that mastiff. She's teaching the dog the route. Hudson said nothing. He was looking at the figure on the screen, and there was something in the posture of those shoulders, in the way that hand held the leash, in the slight tilt of the head when she stopped to look, that made the skin on his scalp prickle, in the same way his instincts had saved his life 7 times in 18 years. Beckett watched for 3 more seconds, then let out a quiet breath. "I've seen this woman before," he said. Hudson turned to him. "Boulder," Beckett continued. "5 months ago, you pulled her out of that bar that night. On Pearl Street, the bar called Red Lark, around 11 at night. You didn't remember that, did you?" Hudson didn't answer right away. He was trying to remember, and that particular memory was slowly rising from the bottom like an object he had dropped into deep water and forgotten. Meanwhile, the puppy in the crate began to whimper, the thin, high sound of a 3-week-old creature that was hungry. Hudson bent down, opened the crate, took the puppy out, and placed it in the palm of his hand. He picked up the syringe Beckett had prepared earlier, drew up 5 milliliters of formula made for newborn puppies that Beckett had bought at the 24-hour veterinary supply store in the nearest town, and gently guided the tip of the syringe to the corner of Piper's mouth. The puppy suckled, clumsy at first, then found a rhythm. At Hudson's feet, the mastiff named Scout had already lain down, its head resting on the top of his foot, and it didn't move away. When Hudson finally pulled that memory up to the surface, he realized he had buried it on purpose, the way a person buries moments that don't fit the version of themselves they want to keep alive. 5 months earlier, Boulder, Pearl Street, the Red Lark Bar. He had gone there after a 6-hour meeting at the St. Julian Hotel, a meeting in which a Chicago partner had tried to renegotiate the terms of a shipping contract signed back in January, and Hudson had been forced to spend the final half hour reminding the man that signed terms weren't proposals. He left the hotel at 10:40 that night, drove 2 blocks, saw the bar's lit sign, and made a decision he rarely made. He had a drink in public. The Red Lark had an old chestnut wood bar, Edison bulbs hanging from the low ceiling, 8 seats at the counter, and 12 small tables along the side. Hudson sat at the end of the bar near the door, ordered a Woodford Reserve neat, and began observing the room out of habit. He had counted 19 people in the bar within the first 40 seconds, classified each one by potential threat, and had already been prepared to return to his car after the first drink. Then he saw her, a young woman sitting 3 stools away from him, chestnut brown hair loosely tied back, wearing a low-collared olive sweater, drinking water instead of alcohol. 3 men had moved closer to her within 10 minutes, and by the time Hudson recognized the pattern, one of them had already placed a hand on her left wrist and held it there. She didn't scream. She only pulled her hand back with a reflex that had clearly been trained into her, and when she did, the sleeve of her sweater slid back 3 centimeters, and Hudson saw the scar. The scar circled her wrist in a shape Hudson knew so well that his body reacted before his mind had time to process it. Wire marks, the kind of scar a person carried after being bound to something solid with plastic-coated steel wire, and struggling hard enough for long enough that the wire cut through the skin beneath the fabric. He had seen that scar 3 times in his life. Once on the wrist of a rival in the year 2012, once on the wrist of a witness in Las Vegas in the year 2015, and once on his own wrist, when he was 17, on a night he had never told anyone about, except the person who had cut the wire and freed him. Hudson set his glass down on the bar. He stood up. He didn't draw a gun, didn't look directly at the 3 men, didn't raise his voice. He only walked over to her chair, placed one hand on the back of it, and said 2 words to the men. Outside. None of the 3 argued. There was something in his voice, or in the way he stood, or in the fact that all 3 were sober enough to recognize that the man in the dark coat standing in front of them wasn't the kind of man anyone should argue with, and they left the counter within 12 seconds. Hudson turned to the young woman. She was looking at him with gray-blue eyes, wide just enough, not panicked, only wary. He pulled out his wallet, took out a plain white business card with only a mobile phone number printed in the center. No name, no title, no logo. He placed the card on the counter in front of her. "If they come back," he said, "call this number." Then he turned and walked away. He had taken 3 steps toward the door when her voice followed him. "Why?" she asked. Hudson stopped. He didn't turn around. He shouldn't have answered, because answering was a mistake, a thin thread someone could pull later, and for 18 years he had never pulled any thread that allowed himself to be traced. But he had been too tired after the meeting, too cold from the wind on Pearl Street, and too touched by something inside himself when he saw the scar on her wrist. "I don't know either," he said, and walked out of the bar. He hadn't thought about that night again once in 5 months. Hudson recounted the memory in short, controlled sentences, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. And by the time he finished, Beckett had completed tracing the phone number on the card. The number belonged to a prepaid SIM, activated through a shell LLC called Red Pine Holdings, registered in Delaware, managed remotely by a law office in Phoenix that Hudson used for transactions that weren't allowed to carry his name. Beckett ran the transaction report for that account over the past 18 months. The account had exactly 1 outgoing transaction, a transfer of $3,200 made in April of last year, paying the annual insurance premium for a property at mailbox address number 412, Owl Creek Avenue, Aspen, Colorado. This house, Beckett looked up from the screen and at Hudson. "1 mistake," he said. "In 18 years. Hudson stared into the space between himself and the window. "Enough," he replied. On the 3rd night after Scout came to the door, The house had settled into a kind of structured silence. Beckett lay on the sofa in the living room, eyes closed but ears awake, the Kimber resting on his chest. Hudson sat at the dining table with the laptop, replaying the Boulder footage for the 17th time, trying to piece together the figure from 5 months ago with the shadow caught on the Forest Road cameras, trying to remember a face he knew perfectly well he had never looked at long enough to remember. Piper was asleep in the crate beneath his chair, her tiny breathing steady as the ticking of a pocket watch. Scout lay stretched across the kitchen doorway, eyes open, one ear lifted. At 1:14 in the morning, the security system gave a short chime, not the sound of a full alarm. This was the back door signal, level 1, meaning someone had touched the lock from outside, but hadn't forced it yet. Beckett opened his eyes and sat up in a single motion. Hudson was already on his feet, the Glock drawn from the holster at his hip, and both men moved toward the kitchen in the diagonal formation they had practiced together for so many years they no longer needed words. Scout got up before them, a low sound rising from its throat, but it wasn't a threatening growl. It was recognition. The kitchen door opened from the outside before Hudson could reach the handle. A woman staggered in. One hand braced against the frame, the other pressed hard to her left shoulder where the gray wool coat had soaked black in a spreading stain from her collarbone down to her elbow. She didn't look at Hudson first. She looked at Scout, and Scout, the 90-kilo dog trained to move through the forest at night carrying another life in its mouth, ran to her with a speed Hudson had never seen from it before, and touched its nose to her cheek with a gentleness so complete it was almost absurd against the animal's size. She dropped to her knees on the tile floor, and Scout sat down beside her, its head resting on her thigh, its tail utterly still. Hudson was there within 2 steps, the Glock aimed downward at the center of her chest. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't lower the gun either. He looked down, and for the first time in 5 months, he saw the face he had once stood only a meter away from in the Red Lark bar, but had never truly looked at. She was 27 years old. Her chestnut brown hair was now matted into damp strands with sweat and rain. Gray-blue eyes, the pupils slightly widened from blood loss, but the gaze still sharp, pale lips. Her left shoulder hung lower because there was no longer enough strength left in the muscle to hold it steady. And on her left wrist, where the sleeve of her coat had ridden up when she fell, Hudson saw again the scar circling the wrist like a cord that had been cut long ago but never disappeared. Beckett had moved around behind her, locked the kitchen door, dropped the bolt, and checked the outside through the slit in the curtain. "Nothing in sight," he said quietly, "but she's left a blood trail from the edge of the forest to here. We can measure this in minutes." The woman lifted her head and looked at Hudson. She swallowed, the effort visible, and when she spoke, her voice was so lucid it startled Hudson more than the fact that she was bleeding onto his kitchen floor. "I have 20 minutes, she said, "before they figure out I came here. I need you to listen in those 20 minutes. Hudson still hadn't lowered the gun. He looked at her, at the blood soaking through the edge of her fingers and dripping onto the tile, at Scout pressing its head into her thigh, at the scar on her wrist that 5 months earlier he had seen beneath the Edison lights of the bar on Pearl Street. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she had come from tonight, or who she was running from, or who she had killed to reach his door. But he knew one thing. The person who had written the note 3 nights earlier, and the person kneeling on his kitchen floor now, were the same woman. "You have 5 minutes, Hudson said, "to tell me why I shouldn't shoot you." The woman didn't blink. She leaned against the door frame to sit up straighter, used her right hand to press harder against the wound in her left shoulder, and drew in one short breath as though she were counting how many bones in her body were still intact. "My name is Willa Hart," she said. "I'm the one who sent Scout to you, and the person hunting me tonight is the same one who shot you 4 nights ago." Hudson didn't lower the gun, but he didn't take another step forward either. Beckett moved behind Willa, standing at an angle where he could both cover the exit and watch the kitchen and the hallway at once. None of the 3 of them bothered trying to help Willa into a chair. She needed to talk, and to talk fast was the only thing that still mattered. Willa swallowed, pressed her hand harder against her shoulder, and began telling it in short sentences, rehearsed so many times in her head that they had become compact enough to fit inside 20 minutes. "My father's name was Elliot Hart," she said. "My mother's name was Marielle. My father was an accountant. Not the kind who worked for companies with offices on the avenue. The kind who worked for families whose names you've called rivals. Specifically, the Kane family. For 17 years, my father kept their books. 3 sets, 1 white, 1 gray, 1 black. Hudson said nothing, but his jaw tightened once. He knew Kane. He had crossed paths with Kane for more than a decade, over 7 contracts in 3 states, until the western branch of that family collapsed from within about 3 years ago, and what remained had devoured itself until there was no one left important enough to remember by name. Willa went on. 3 years ago, in October, my father and mother were driving from Denver back to Fort Collins on Route 471, leading up to I-70. It was a 2019 Lexus, well-maintained, with newly replaced tires. At the curve near the Georgetown entrance, the brakes failed. The car went through the guardrail and down into a ravine 25 meters deep. They were both dead before the car stopped. The Colorado police report concluded it was an accident caused by brake system failure. I was 24 then. I was in my final year of veterinary school at Colorado State University. I dropped out after the funeral. Hudson looked at her, the Glock still not lowered. She told this part in an even voice, not rising, not breaking. Willa lowered her head to the floor for 1 second, then lifted it again. My father left behind a rented storage unit in Fort Collins, she said. I didn't know about it until the storage bill was mailed to my house 3 months after the funeral, because my father had paid a year in advance. I drove there, unlocked it, and found 11 plastic file boxes lined up against the wall. It took me 2 years to read everything. My father was careful. He wrote by hand, made notes in the margins, cross-referenced documents with color codes. He had known something was wrong at least 6 months before he died, because he had started copying unusual entries into a separate ledger, leather-bound, hidden inside a false bottom in box number 7. Willa paused and took a breath. I found a name in that ledger, she continued. A name that appeared across 7 different transactions over 4 years. A name that didn't belong to the Kane family, but had withdrawn money from Kane accounts and moved it into shell accounts tied to another organization. An organization my father had circled in red ink in the margin, with 2 initials beside it. H.C. Tucked behind that ledger was an old, unauthorized background report Porter had commissioned on your early life in Scottsdale. It mentioned the shed, the blood, and a yellow Labrador named Scout. I renamed the Mastiff that day, knowing that if I sent her to you with that name, you would be forced to remember your own humanity. Hudson didn't blink, but he felt the air in the kitchen thin for 1 beat. Willa looked straight at him. I spent the next 6 months, she said, finding out who H.C. was. And once I knew, I spent another 8 months finding out whether you were the one who ordered my parents killed. 5 months ago, I concluded you weren't. You didn't know my father existed. You didn't know Elliot Hart had copied your transactions. You were only the man the money was flowing to, but the man moving the money, the one signing every transaction with an internal code only your inner circle knew, the one who killed my parents 3 years ago to silence them, and the one who shot you 4 nights ago at the meeting near Cheyenne, is the same man. Willa stopped. 2 more drops of blood slipped through her fingers onto the tile, and Scout pressed its head deeper into her thigh. She almost whispered the name. Porter, she said. Hudson stood still for 4 seconds. He didn't ask her to repeat it. He didn't demand proof. He only lowered the Glock, 1 inch, the Mubso, and set it on the kitchen counter beside him. Porter Kane, he breathed out. And the sound wasn't a question, and it wasn't denial either, but the sound of a man hearing for the first time a truth his body had known long before his mind had allowed it. Willa gave the smallest nod when she heard Hudson say that name, as if she had been waiting to hear it come out of his mouth for the past 2 years. Porter, she said. Isn't his real name? His real name is Porter Redgrave. Not Kane, but Kane by blood, a maternal cousin-nephew from the Denver branch. His mother was Marlo Kane's second cousin, the man who ran the northern branch until the year 2020, when that branch collapsed from within, in a civil war between 2 brother branches. Most of the family members outside the direct line either ran or changed their names, and Porter did both at once. He dropped the Redgrave surname, bought a clean set of papers in New Mexico under a false maternal name as Kane, and slipped into your organization 6 years ago as the intermediary for a transport supplier in Nevada, whom you knew retired 6 months later. No one checked again. No one asked why the old intermediary stepped away at exactly the moment the new one appeared. Hudson sat down in the kitchen chair, not because his knees were weak, because he needed a surface to set the weight of what he had just heard onto, and his body had run out of room to hold any more. Porter had been his right hand for 4 years. Porter had sat in his conference room in Denver, had gone with him to Las Vegas 11 times, had known the code to the secondary safe, had been invited to Christmas dinner at the Cherry Hills Village estate last year, and sat in the third seat from the left. Porter had been the only man besides Beckett whom Hudson had ever authorized to sign grade A shipping contracts in his absence. Beckett had stood motionless through Willa's account, his face unchanged. But at this point he let out a long breath through his nose, and Hudson knew Beckett had just run through the same list in his head of all the doors Porter had once been allowed to open. "My father found out 3 years ago," Willa continued. "Not through paperwork, through a photograph. There was a wedding in Taos in the year 2019, the wedding of a partner's son, where both my father and Porter were invited but seated at different tables because they worked for different clients. My father recognized Porter from an old photograph in the Kane files, from when Porter was 19 and still went by Redgrave. My father didn't say anything at the wedding. He went home, pulled the files back out, confirmed it, and started copying the transactions. 3 weeks later, his brakes failed on Route 471. My mother was on that trip because they were both on their way to a friend's birthday in Fort Collins. Porter didn't know my mother would be in the car. Or maybe he did and didn't care. I've stopped trying to guess that part." Willa drew in one short breath, adjusted the hand pressed against her wound, and looked at Hudson. "I knew you existed 2 years ago," she said, "when I got to file box number 7. I knew you weren't the one who ordered my parents killed by the 6th month of the first year of my investigation, because the timelines didn't match. But I needed to be sure. I needed to see you from close enough to know whether you could be the kind of man who'd hear this story and not shoot me. 5 months ago," Porter realized I was watching him. He didn't know how much I knew, but he knew I was getting close to a name. He staged a test. The 3 men at the Red Lark on Pearl Street that night were Porter's men. They weren't ordered to hurt me. They were ordered to sit in the bar, see you walk in, and push me hard enough to see whether you'd react. If you reacted, it would have meant you already knew who I was, and Porter would have had a next plan for both of us. If you didn't react, it would have meant you didn't know, and Porter could keep living quietly inside your organization. Willa let out one very short laugh, with no joy in it. "You reacted," she said, "but not in the way Porter expected. You didn't recognize me because you didn't know who I was. You only saw a woman with a scar around her wrist, and 3 men standing too close, and you stood up for a reason even you didn't know. Porter thought you'd either ignore it or recognize me. You did the third thing he never accounted for. You saved me for no reason, and that is the only thing that kept me alive long enough to reach your door tonight." Willa shifted her weight against the kitchen door frame, trying to sit a little straighter, and she kept talking before Hudson could ask anything more. "After the night at the Red Lark," she said, "I knew 2 things at once. One was that you weren't the one who ordered my parents killed. The other was that I would never get close to you again in any ordinary way. You had turned your back and walked away, and I was left standing there with a plain white card and a phone number I knew for certain would lead to a dead end if I called it. I went back to my apartment in Boulder that night and sat on the kitchen floor for 6 hours until dawn, and by 7 in the morning I had a plan. Not a good plan, but the only plan I could carry out alone. I studied veterinary medicine for 4 years before I left. During those 4 years, I interned at 2 clinics and 1 canine rescue that worked with Boulder police. I learned enough about a dog's sense of smell to know that a properly trained dog could find a destination by scent with a level of accuracy human beings would never truly understand. I chose a Neapolitan Mastiff for 2 reasons. First, they are large enough to carry something weighing 2 kilos through the forest at night without collapsing from exhaustion. Second, they are a breed that gives loyalty to one person only, and once they choose that person, they don't leave. Scout came from the Boulder Canine Rescue in October. 3 years old, female, abandoned after her owner died and no relative wanted to take her in. I paid $600 in adoption fees and signed a lifetime care commitment. The next 4 months, I spent teaching her 2 things. The road to this house, and your scent. Willa swallowed. Scout pressed her nose into Willa's thigh. The route was the easier part. She went on. I got the address of this house by tracing the phone number on your card. I drove to the Aspen area 17 times in 4 months, parked in a different place each time, and walked with Scout along the eastern trails near the house. Never close enough for the cameras to catch my face clearly, but close enough for Scout to learn the route by the smell of the earth and the shape of the woods. Your scent was the harder part. I needed enough samples for Scout to memorize you from 3 different sources and merge them into one single scent profile. I watched the Pearl Street cleaners in Denver, where you send your clothes every 2 weeks through a delivery service. I waited outside for 9 days. And on the 9th day, I got hold of 2 sweaters the cleaners had discarded because buttons had been damaged in the wash. They were labeled with customer code 2643, and I confirmed that code was yours through an employee I spoke to 3 times over the course of a month. I went to the Ink coffee shop, where you stop every Tuesday morning when you're in Denver, and I bought the wooden chair in the corner when the owner changed the furniture in August. $500 for a chair worth $50. I bought a bottle of Creed Aventus from the same production batch as the bottle I saw you use the night at the bar. 3 sources. 3 scent layers. I exposed Scout to them every day for 3 months, combined with the root, until she could go from the drop point to your door without me beside her. Willa let out a faint laugh, dry and exhausted. There was one part of the plan I didn't account for, she said. Scout was pregnant in the 5th week of training, by a male from the rescue before I adopted her. I didn't know until the 2nd month. By then I couldn't stop the plan. Piper was born 3 weeks ago. I had meant to wait until Piper was weaned. But 3 nights ago, Porter hit my apartment in Boulder. 4 men, 1 black truck, 10 that night. I had 12 minutes of warning from the rear door camera. I took Scout, took the crate with Piper inside, and drove to the drop point east of the Aspen Forest line. I couldn't go with Scout because my car had been tagged somewhere with a tracker, and they were following the vehicle trail, not human footprints. I wrote the note on the hood of the car in the rain. I tied it to Scout's collar. I gave her the order to go, and I ran in the opposite direction to draw them away from the path she was taking. I thought I could survive 48 hours. I survived 72, and that is why I am here tonight, with a bullet in my shoulder and nowhere left to go. Willa looked at Hudson. You have listened for 17 minutes, she said. I have 3 minutes left before I pass out. I need you to decide now. Hudson had already picked up the phone before Willa could finish her last sentence. He pressed a different speed dial key, left it on speaker for 1 second so Beckett could hear the instruction, then raised it to his ear. Finn, he said when the person on the other end answered. Aspen. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder. 3 in the morning. The voice on the other end didn't ask why, didn't ask who. Only answered with one short sound of acknowledgement and hung up. Hudson set the phone down, turned to Beckett, and Beckett was already bending to lift Willa without waiting for an order. They carried her to the leather sofa in the living room, cut away the wool coat with Beckett's emergency trauma shears, and peeled off the olive sweater underneath, now soaked black. The wound was in her left shoulder, about 4 centimeters below the clavicle joint. A 9mm round had gone through soft tissue but hadn't struck bone, hadn't touched a major artery. Beckett held the bleeding with pressure gauze, while Hudson kept Willa's head steady, gave her a sip of water, and watched her try not to close her eyes. Scout didn't leave her side for the entire 40 minutes they waited for Finn to arrive. Finn O'Brien arrived at 4:10 in the morning in a dark blue Chevrolet Suburban, with no plates. He was 61 years old, with silver-white hair, a brown leather jacket worn thin at both elbows, and he carried the same black medical bag he hadn't replaced in 30 years of unlicensed practice. He had once been a trauma surgeon at St. Luke Hospital in Denver, until the year 2007, when an illegal midnight abortion for a senator's wife ended his official career and began the one Hudson was paying for now. Finn didn't greet anyone. He glanced at Willa on the sofa, gave Beckett a single nod, and went to work. He injected a local anesthetic, removed the bullet with forceps in 4 minutes, flushed the wound with antiseptic solution, and closed it with 7 non-absorbable stitches. He dressed the wound with sterile gauze, taped it in place, and took Willa's blood pressure 3 times until the numbers settled where he wanted them. She'll live, Finn said, standing and stripping off his gloves. Significant blood loss, but not dangerous. Let her sleep for 6 hours. When she wakes, give her light food, plenty of water, and don't let her stand too soon. Hudson led him into the kitchen to sign the paperwork that left no paper trail, and there, with the 2 men standing across from each other beside the granite counter, Finn looked at Hudson with the eyes of a man who had watched men and women bleed on his table for 30 years. "This one matters to you?" Finn asked, his voice low but not a whisper. "She knows who Porter is," Hudson answered. Finn nodded slowly. "Then she'll die without you," he said, lifting the envelope, and walked out the door without another word. Willa slept for 6 hours and 13 minutes. When she opened her eyes, it was morning. A gray, cold aspen light in February filtering through the curtains. and the smell of black coffee drifting through the house. She sat up slowly, her left shoulder stiff but not painful when used correctly, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. Hudson was already sitting at the dining table with 1 cup of coffee in front of him and a second cup already poured at the place opposite him. He didn't look up when she sat down, but he pushed the second cup toward her. Scout followed Willa into the kitchen and lay down between them. She took a sip. Hudson waited until she had managed a second before he spoke. "There is a way out for you," he began. "I will kill Porter within the next 2 weeks. After that, I will transfer to you a full set of new papers, a clean identity, $2 million in an untraceable account, and the keys to a house in a place where you will never hear the names Porter or Kane or Hart again. You will disappear, and no one in the rest of this world will know you ever existed. That is the only right thing I can do for you." Willa set the coffee cup down. She looked straight at Hudson. For the first time since last night, not through a layer of pain. Her eyes were gray, blue, and calm, and unblinking. "I don't want to disappear," she said. "I want my parents' names spoken by someone who understands the price of their deaths." Hudson looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he repeated them, 1 syllable at a time, slowly enough that each name had room to fall into the space between them. Elliot and Muriel Hart. After the 2 names had fallen between them, Hudson and Willa sat still for 10 seconds without either of them touching their coffee. Then Hudson stood up, called Beckett into the kitchen, and spread a blank sheet of A4 paper across the dining table. He didn't use a computer. He had learned long ago that important plans were always written by hand and burned afterward. "The plan has 3 parts," he said, "and takes 48 hours. Willa stays in Aspen with Beckett, Scout, and Piper. She does not leave the house under any circumstances. She does not turn on a phone. She does not answer the door. If anyone other than Beckett or me rings the bell, she goes down to the basement, locks the steel door, and waits." Beckett gave a single nod. Hudson continued. "I go to Denver. Safe deposit box number 87 at the Wells Fargo branch on 17th Street. Inside the box is a USB drive I put there in the year 2022. It contains a recording of a meeting between Porter and me from June of that year, where he mentioned a name that I ignored at the time, but now remember belonged to someone in the Kane organization. I recorded every internal meeting from the day I built this organization. That was policy. Porter knew the policy. He doesn't know I kept the recording of that meeting. That's one piece. The second piece is in Fort Collins," Hudson said, turning to Willa. "Your father's leather-bound ledger, the backup drive. You said there were 11 file boxes in the storage unit. I need the exact location." Willa gave him the storage unit number, the lock code, the position of box number 7 in the 3rd row from the door, and the false bottom hidden beneath the paper lining. Beckett wrote down every detail on a second sheet, then burned both pieces of paper in the sink after committing them to memory. "When I return from Denver," Hudson said, "Beckett goes to Fort Collins. We meet back here in 48 hours. Once we have both pieces of evidence, I call a Carrick family meeting at the Cherry Hills Village estate. 5 people at senior level. Porter is one of them. Not showing up to that meeting would expose him at once. He will come. He will walk into that room believing he's steering a war he won a long time ago. I will let him walk into that room, and I will finish this there." Willa didn't ask what finish meant. She was old enough to know. Beckett went into the living room to check the security system, leaving Hudson and Willa alone in the kitchen. Hudson opened the drawer beneath the sink, took out a flat aluminum box, and set it on the table in front of her. Inside was a Sig Sauer P226, fully loaded, safety on, with a spare 15-round magazine beside it. He pushed the box toward her. She looked down at the gun, then back up at him. "Do you trust me?" she asked. Her voice wasn't challenging. It was only a question she needed to hear answered. Hudson buttoned his coat, put on his sunglasses, and picked up the keys to the black SUV parked in the garage. "I'm giving you a loaded gun," he said. "The answer is in that." He opened the kitchen door leading into the garage, paused for 1 second at the threshold, without turning around. "Scout is with you," he added. "It knows the sound of my footsteps and Beckett's. If it growls, don't ask why. Shoot." Then he closed the door, and the sound of the V8 engine starting rolled through the garage's concrete walls like one short low note, then faded farther and farther away down the northern forest road toward Interstate 70. Hudson made it back to Denver at 11:20 in the morning, 163 miles in 2 hours and 14 minutes along the widened stretch of Interstate 70. He parked the black Range Rover in the underground garage of the Wells Fargo building on 17th Street, didn't use a valet, took the stairs up to the ground floor himself, and walked into the bank lobby with the stride of an ordinary client stealing a task into the lunch hour. The branch manager recognized him from a distance, didn't greet him out loud, only led him straight down to the safe deposit level in the basement, without asking for signatures, because Hudson's name didn't exist on any paperwork connected to box number 87. The box code was a sequence of 6 characters he had memorized 17 years earlier. The drawer slid out smoothly. Inside were 4 things: a stack of backup passports, a packet of European cash, a titanium utility knife, and a 32-gigabyte USB drive wrapped in a gray metal shell with a label marked June 8, 2022. He took the USB, slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, closed the box, and was back upstairs in 8 minutes total. He exited the building at 11:37. He had just settled into the driver's seat, shut the car door, and started the engine when the satellite phone vibrated once. A message from Beckett, encrypted, 4 words. Porter knows Aspen. Hudson looked at the screen for 2 seconds. Then a second message appeared immediately after it, also 4 words. Moving her to basement. He hit call. 1 ring, 2, 3. On the 4th ring, the line picked up, and Hudson heard exactly 3 sounds before the call died. The first sound was Beckett breathing hard, the kind of breathing a man makes when he's running while calculating lines of fire. The second was Scout's low growl, the one Hudson had recognized from the first night as the sound of recognition rather than threat. But this time it carried a different intensity, something that had shifted from guarding to readiness. The third sound was glass breaking. Then the line went dead. Hudson didn't call back. He knew the deadline wasn't because of signal loss. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The Range Rover shot out of the underground garage onto 17th Street, cut across 3 lanes toward Interstate 25, and was headed west on 70 within 11 minutes of the line going dead. 163 miles back to Aspen, 4 hours at a normal pace. He did it in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The speedometer drifted between 120 and 140 miles an hour across the strait, stretches through Genesee, over Eisenhower Pass, down toward Glenwood Springs, and no police stopped him because the plates on this vehicle were tied to a false government identity good enough that automatic license plate systems passed over it without question. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call Finn. He didn't call anyone else in the organization, because if Porter knew Aspen, then Porter had also penetrated the communications network, and every person Hudson called would be one more chance for Porter to trace the place he was racing toward. During those 2 hours and 40 minutes, Hudson thought about only one thing. He didn't think about the USB in his pocket. He didn't think about the Carrick family meeting that was coming. He didn't think about Porter Redgrave, and the 4 years Porter had sat beside him in conference rooms. He thought about the plastic crate with 4 ventilation holes and the liner holding steady at 38 degrees. He thought about Piper, 2.8 kilos, breathing in small, even rhythms like the ticking of a pocket watch, down in the basement of a house that was about to come under attack. And somewhere between Vale Pass and the turnoff onto Route 4222, he realized that this was the first time in 18 years of running his empire that he was driving toward something instead of driving away from it. Everything he had built since he was 19 years old had been built on the principle that running away was wiser than running toward. His father had taught him that in the shed in Scottsdale 29 years earlier with 1 sentence and 1 dead dog. Now he was erasing that lesson with both hands on the wheel and 1 foot pressed flat to the floorboard, and he didn't know whether that made him a wiser man or a dead one in the making. But he knew he wouldn't get there in time if he stopped to find out. Hudson reached the eastern tree line of the house as dusk was falling, the sun already gone behind the Elk Mountains, and the only light left a low red-orange band stretched across the tops of the pines. He left the car 400 meters from the house on a narrow dirt track known only to deer and Beckett, and went into the woods on foot with the Glock already drawn. The smell of smoke came before the sight, burning pine mixed with the hot plastic reek of insulation, and somewhere beneath it was the smell of spent gunpowder gone cold, a smell he had known since Afghanistan in his younger years. He took a southern arc, not a direct line toward the house, and when he reached the final observation point, 30 meters from the back wall, he saw it. The left wing was burning. The master bedroom and study had partially collapsed through the roof, black smoke curling into the gray sky in a short, thick column because the evening wind had begun pressing it downward, and 2 first-floor windows were shattered into jagged edges. The right wing was still intact, but the front door had been blown off its hinges and now hung crooked in the frame. Hudson counted bodies in the woods. The first corpse lay about 17 meters from the kitchen door, face down, with a single bullet hole in the middle of the upper back. The second was closer, 6 meters from the rear steps, on its back, with 2 bullet holes in the chest over the heart. The third was at the northern edge of the forest, collapsed over a fallen tree trunk, an AR-15 lying 2 steps away. The fourth he found last, right on the wooden steps leading into the right wing, with a gunshot wound to the throat. 4 men, all dead from 9mm rounds, fired in controlled pairs or single shots into vital points. This was Beckett's work. Hudson knew at once. No one else in the organization shot like this anymore. He stepped over the fourth body and entered the main hallway. The smoke inside was thinner than he had expected because the automatic ventilation system had activated, but the floor was littered with scorched wood and broken glass. He heard the groan before he saw him. Beckett was sitting with his back braced against the base of the staircase leading upstairs. His left leg stretched out, his thigh soaked with blood that had dried into a dark, heavy stain around the wound. The Kimber 911 was still in his hand, the barrel aimed at the living room doorway, 3 rounds left in the magazine from the way he was holding the grip. When he saw Hudson, he didn't lower the gun right away, only gave one short nod and lowered it when he confirmed him. "Basement," Beckett said, his voice ragged and breathless. "Steel door. I got her down there before they broke the front door. Both dogs are with her. She's got the SIG. Porter is down there. He's been trying to get the door open for the last 10 minutes. I don't know what he brought. Could be C4. Could be hydraulic cutters. I can't get down there. My thigh won't hold me up." Hudson dropped to one knee beside Beckett, checked the wound quickly with his eyes, tore a pillowcase from the sofa nearby, and pressed it against Beckett's thigh with enough force to make him suck in one short breath. No major artery can be held. He placed his right hand on Beckett's shoulder for exactly 1 second, a touch the 2 men had never exchanged in 18 years, but both understood. Then checked the Glock's magazine, pulled a spare from the inner pocket of his coat, and moved past Beckett toward the oak door leading down to the basement. He opened it without a sound, disengaged the safety, and started down. The staircase leading down to the basement had 14 oak steps, covered with a thin layer of sound, dampening carpet, since the last time the house had been renovated. Hudson knew exactly which steps creaked, and which stayed silent, and he went down along the outer edge of each tread, placing his weight little by little, taking 2 minutes and 12 seconds to reach the bottom. The only light came from 2 recessed ceiling fixtures at the far end of the underground corridor, and he heard Porter before he saw him. Metal striking metal, steady and rhythmic, something trying to cut through the hinges of the steel door from the outside angle with a battery-powered cutter smaller than ideal for that kind of work. Hudson moved past the final corner of the wall. Porter Redgrave was kneeling on one knee in front of the steel door leading into the safe room, his back to the staircase, the handheld cutter in his right hand, and a Beretta 92 FS in a holster at his left hip. He was 44 years old, wearing a black wool coat, damp at the shoulders from the rain, and giving all of his attention to the carbon steel hinge of the door. Hudson stood 4 meters away. He didn't need to raise his voice. "Porter," he said, his tone low and even. Porter stopped the cutter. 3 seconds passed before he turned his head, and when he did, there was none of the surprise Hudson had half expected to see. Only the calm of a man who had weighed every possible scenario and knew none of them favored him anymore. "You're early," Porter said. "You're 4 years late," Hudson answered. Porter set the cutter down on the concrete floor, slowly, with the movements of a man calculating where his hands should go next to buy himself 4 more seconds. "The girl," he said, "has only theories. She read her father's books, connected the wrong points, and came to you because she had no one else left to come to. There's no evidence out of that Fort Collins storage unit strong enough to convict me in a room with a jury." Hudson slipped his left hand into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out the USB drive and held it up at chest level, letting the recessed light catch on the gray metal casing. "She has me," he said. "And you've forgotten your own internal recording policy. June of the year 2022. You said a name in the Denver conference room. I ignored it then. I remembered it last night." Porter looked at the USB for 5 full heartbeats. When he looked back at Hudson again, his right shoulder dropped by 0.5 centimeter, and Hudson recognized that movement from 10 years earlier, when Porter first entered the organization. It was the tell that came before a draw. Porter moved fast, Hudson moved faster. 2 shots. The first went into Porter's right shoulder, dead center through the deltoid muscle, tearing through flesh without striking bone, and sent the Beretta clattering to the floor in one single metallic crack. The second went into his right knee, shattered the kneecap, and dropped Porter sideways to the left in a broken kneel on the concrete. He didn't cry out. He had been trained not to cry out, and even in betrayal, Porter still kept a few things he had been taught back when he was still Redgrave. Hudson took 3 steps toward him. He kicked the Beretta away, far enough that Porter couldn't reach it with his good arm, then dropped to one knee half a meter from him. He didn't raise the Glock. He only rested the muzzle lightly against the concrete, pointing straight upward. "Elliot Hart," Hudson said, his voice stripped of everything that could be stripped away. "Marielle Hart. Remember their names before you go." Porter looked up at him. His lips moved as if he were about to say something. Maybe a name, maybe an excuse, maybe a curse. Hudson didn't let him finish. He raised the Glock 2 centimeters and fired one last shot into the center of Porter's forehead. The gunshot in the sealed concrete basement rang back like the final closing of a steel door, echoing into the underground corridor, up the oak staircase, then fading into silence. Behind the steel door, 3 meters away, Scout barked exactly once, low, short, and final, like a period at the end of a sentence. Piper stayed quiet. Willa was sitting on the concrete floor on the other side of the door, her back against the wall, both arms wrapped around Scout and the crate with Piper inside, the Sig Sauer in her right hand hanging loose against her thigh. She wasn't crying. She only closed her eyes for 1 second when she heard Scout bark, and when she opened them again, in the darkness of the safe room lit only by the red glow of the emergency LED light, the corner of her mouth tightened very slightly, like someone who had just set down a burden she had been carrying for 3 years. 6 months passed faster than Hudson had expected, and slower than Willa had. In the first 8 weeks, Hudson did the one thing he knew how to do best, which was to purge. The hidden network Porter Redgrave had quietly built inside the Carrick organization consisted of 11 names spread across 4 states and 3 legal shell branches. Hudson didn't call the family meeting as the original plan had intended, because it was no longer necessary. Porter was dead in the basement in Aspen, and the remaining men in his network didn't know that until each of them was summoned separately to final meetings that none of them lived long enough to describe. The evidence surrounding the deaths of Elliot and Marielle Hart, the hard drive from box number 7, and the leather-bound ledger that Beckett recovered from the Fort Collins storage unit 10 days after the fire were sent anonymously to the Denver FBI office through a mailbox in Salt Lake City. Within 3 months, the final 3 surviving names from the Western Kane branch were indicted. 2 were sentenced to prison without parole, and 1 died before trial from a heart attack that no one in the prosecutor's office believed was natural. The Hart file was reopened. The Colorado papers didn't write much because no one in the newsroom understood what the Hart name meant, but a young reporter at the Denver Post published an 1,800-word article in the 5th month with the simple title, "An Accountant and His Daughter." And that article was the first time in 3 years that the names Elliot and Marielle Hart were printed in words outside an investigative report. Willa read the article the morning it appeared. She didn't cry. She only set the paper down on the kitchen table, finished her coffee, and sat still for 11 minutes. She stayed in Aspen for the first 5 weeks, so her shoulder could heal, then moved down to the house in Cherry Hills Village at the beginning of the 3rd month. No one discussed it out loud. One morning she packed 2 canvas bags into Beckett's SUV, and by that same evening, the veterinary tools she had spent 4 months replacing piece by piece had been moved into one of the empty rooms in the Cherry Hills Village house, and that was the answer they gave each other without words. In Hudson's study on the 1st floor of the house, on the floor-to-ceiling walnut bookshelf, his predecessor had commissioned from a workshop in Vermont, there was a plastic transport crate sitting on a shelf at eye level. The old crate, with its 4 ventilation holes yellowed at the edges, still carried a small scratch in the lower left corner from the claws of a 3-week-old puppy that had once lain inside it. Piper was now 8 months old, weighed 32 kilos, had grown nearly twice the size of the crate that once carried her, and every afternoon she slept under Hudson's desk with her head resting on the top of his foot, out of a habit she had chosen for herself and that no one had taught her. Scout slept by the door. One afternoon in August, Willa passed the study and stopped for 3 seconds to look at the crate on the shelf. Without turning her head, she asked why he hadn't thrown it away. Hudson didn't answer right away. He had learned long ago that important questions deserved to be answered when the answer had ripened, not while it was still hot. 3 days later, while she was standing at the kitchen island cutting lemons, he said, "Because it was the first thing anyone ever sent me that wasn't a threat. And I want to remember that." She didn't turn around. She only gave the slightest nod and kept cutting lemons. There was a difference, Hudson had thought many times during those 6 months, between sending someone away and sending someone to someone. Willa had not sent Scout and Piper away from herself. She had sent them to a person. And the difference between those two verbs was the entire distance between someone giving up and someone believing that somewhere in this world there was still a door worth knocking on at 2:47 in the morning. For 18 years, Hudson had been the man standing inside those doors and always choosing not to open them. One night, one dog, and one piece of paper taught him that some doors were worth opening, and that the price of opening them wasn't always what his father had taught him in the shed in Scottsdale. The final scene of those 6 months was a September morning in the kitchen at Cherry Hills Village, sunlight filtering through the east-facing windows, Willa pouring coffee into 2 white ceramic mugs, Piper standing on her hind legs at the glass door barking nonstop at a yellow butterfly perched outside, Scout lifting her head from the cushion by the door when she heard Hudson's footsteps coming down the hall. Willa didn't turn when he walked in. She only said, "You're late." Hudson stood in the kitchen doorway for 1 second, looking at her back, at the 2 steaming mugs of coffee, at Piper, and the butterfly and Scout. And then he said, "I'm home." Sometimes a story isn't about a man saving a woman, and it isn't about a woman saving a man either. Sometimes it's only about 2 people who have stood on opposite sides of the same door for many years. And one night someone knocked softly enough not to threaten, and loudly enough not to be ignored. The kindest thing we can do for one another in this life, perhaps, isn't to never need each other, but to know how to knock on the right door when the time comes, and to know how to open it when someone has walked a long road through the rain just to reach your front step. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last minute. If the story of Hudson and Willa touched you in any way, even if it was only a small moment that made you stop and think, please don't forget to hit like, share this video with someone you think also needs to hear a story like this, and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet, so that every day you can listen to more stories that are moving, thoughtful, and rich with meaning about human life. We'd truly love to know what you think about this story. Have you ever, at some point in your life, knocked on someone's door without knowing for sure whether they would open it, or opened the door for someone without knowing why you did? Leave a comment below and share your honest feelings, because every story you tell is the heartbeat that keeps this channel alive. We wish you, the person watching this video, good health always, a joyful life every day, and peace in your soul, no matter what threshold life may bring you to. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.